Today's reading is from Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. It says, "One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees saying to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.'" This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is James Rathmann. I'm the pastor here, but you all know that. And I can tell because this morning looking out here and the folks that I know are in the overflow room, I realized that I know all of your names. Zach's a good worship pastor. That song, I think, kind of got me. You know, my time as your pastor has had a number of challenges, and it's been a very strange time. And we're in a season of church, as many are, where we're experiencing just like these, just COVID sucks, right? But there's a sweetness to this. There's a sweetness to this season of ministry. As a pastor, we're in a time in our church where I get to know all of you. And I just want you to know that I savor that. All right, let's preach the sermon I wrote. This is like one of those nightmares where you're crying on stage. Regarding that, and maybe if one of you wants to go grab some tissues out of my office, that'd be fine. The shape of the church that we want to have is one where we are really known. We are a real community that gets to know each other. I was thinking when I was lighting this candle, which was strange and uncomfortable. We're lighting the Hope candle today, and I was lighting it in our Advent wreath, which was made by Danielle Gunter. Many of you know. We've got a bespoke Advent wreath, just kind of made for love of worship as our community. And it, like many, they're in a season where in-person attendance just doesn't seem wise or safe at this time. We want to remember those folks, that they would be in our prayers. And just that the Lord, as we wait we're in a season of Advent and longing, as Zach was saying, part of that longing is that we would be able to come together again. Oh, thanks. This is John, one of our elders. If you're in his parish, expect the same level of service. Parish dinners are something that we're looking forward to launching this next coming year. And what that means is when you're a member of our church, you're a part of a parish. And that means an elder is directly connected to you and takes a personal responsibility for you. And one of the main functions of that that we want to have happen is what we're calling parish dinners. And basically it just means you and the rest of the folks in your parish go eat in each other's homes. And the elder will have you into their home to eat, to learn to feast together and enjoy one another. If you'd like to become a member, you can do that just by emailing info@Redemption Denver, and we'll reach out to you and connect and talk through that process. Okay, ready for a sermon? Let's pray. Holy Father, thank you for your presence, your care. Thank you that you did come, that child was Jesus. Lord, I pray that today as we look through this text, we would get to see a clear picture of who you are, of who Christ is. Lord, let it enliven our hearts. Lift us up in Jesus' name. All right, I've got a pretty clever take on this text today, so get excited. In Greek mythology, there's this character called Procrustes. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And Procrustes owned an inn on the way into Athens. And Procrustes had this sort of strange form of hospitality that he would show to the guests in his inn. He had a bed. And Procrustes' bed, he wanted to make sure fit every guest that sat or that slept in the bed precisely. And in order to make sure that the bed fit the guest precisely, he wouldn't alter the bed, but he would alter the guest. It was a pretty cruel, it was a pretty particular form of cruelty. So what would happen is if a guest would show up and he would invite him into his inn and he would lay down in this Procrustean bed, and the bed would, if he was too short for the bed, then he would stretch the guest to make sure that he fit the bed. And if he was too tall for the bed, then Procrustes would hem the guest to make sure that he fit precisely in the bed. Now, later on, Procrustes meets his match in Theseus, who places Procrustes in his own bed, and as it turns out, Procrustes' head was just a little too large for his own bed. And so he was likewise hemmed by Theseus and died of his own bed. Now, the Procrustean bed, you've probably seen pictures of the stretcher. But what we see in the story today is that the Pharisees try and lay Jesus into their own Procrustean bed. And what Jesus confronts them with is he shows them that he is the one who made the bed. And the bed was not made for our destruction. The bed was made for our rest. And so Jesus teaches us how to properly relate to the bed that God has given us. That more clearly, that's the law that God has given us. So let's go ahead and look at the story, how it unfolds. Mark 2, verses 23 to 24. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Okay, so it's a simple picture. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field. It's the Sabbath day. And some of his disciples grab, a head of grain and they roll off the husk in their hands and they're eating some grain as they walk through the field. And Pharisees are looking on and they say, "Look, they're harvesting grain. That's not lawful to be done on the Sabbath." And so they confront Jesus and they say, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to be done on the Sabbath. They're harvesting grain and they're rolling it." Now, here's what's wrong with the Pharisees' accusation. It's not illegal. It's not against the Torah. There's no biblical command against grabbing some grain and rolling it in your hand and eating it on the Sabbath. There's no command in the Sabbath against any of the normal maintenance of life, against anything like eating or cooking or grabbing a snack. There's no command like that in the Torah, so that Jesus is not breaking any laws. Now, around the Sabbath, there developed this huge amount of extra biblical writing by rabbis at the time who would say, okay, we see the Sabbath law and it commands us to rest, so we've got to make sure that we define clearly what work and what rest is. And that extra biblical writing had taken on a flavor of what the law itself was, but it was well beyond the law. It was not in line with the intention of the law. Instead, it was something more than what the law required. Now, Jesus' answer is strange, because what Jesus could have simply said was, "Get out your Bibles. Show me where I'm breaking the law. Bring me to the Sabbath commandments in Deuteronomy 5 or Exodus 20, and show me where is it that I'm violating any of what God had commanded, or that my disciples are violating any of what God had commanded. And the Pharisees would have had to have simply said, well, I guess according to the Bible, God's word, you're not violating any of what was commanded. Jesus could have said simply that. You're doing what is not lawful. No, I'm not. I'm well within the boundary of the law. Would have been simple for Jesus to articulate that. But instead, he says something much more. And he goes to the heart of the matter where he asks a better question. I read this morning that in school, you're given questions and then asked to produce the right answers. But in life, people more often give you a bunch of answers and then you need to produce better questions. Isn't that true? I think that's so true. But this is a situation just like that. Jesus is presented with an answer, and then he presents a better question to the Pharisees. And he's going to break down their understanding of their own relationship to the law, as well as their understanding of Christ's relationship to the law. So let's look at the story that Jesus answers with. Mark 2, 25 to 26. And he said to them, How have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. Okay, so Jesus tells a story that they should have been familiar with. And this is about David. And David is on the run from King Saul, and he's got a group of people that have rallied around him to run with him. And they're sort of secretly fly in the night, and then they come upon one of the holy places in Israel. And it's a sanctuary where the altar was, and the bread of presence was laid before the altar every day, and then it was consumed later by the priests. It was an offering to the Lord. Bread of presence is an offering that's meant to signify God's provision for his people. Just as when they were wandering in the desert and God provided them manna from heaven, it's the same God who provides their daily bread. And that's what the bread of presence symbolizes. But the bread of presence has these conditions around it, which is that it is only meant to be eaten by the priest, and it's meant to be laid out daily. And there's a ceremony, a process that goes along with the bread of presence. David shows up with his men, secretly fleeing Saul. They're hungry, and they know that they have a long road ahead of them. They're at this temple, and they need food. So the priest asks them, who's actually Ahimelech, who is Abiathar's father. Jesus references this as Abiathar's time, because Abiathar was there. It's a long story. And Ahimelech says that he would provide them with the food so long as that they were clean. And he says, yes, my men are ceremonially clean. And this is likely just for the priest to cleanse his own conscience, knowing that he's sharing a holy bread at a time that's outside of its conditions. And so the priest's conscience is clean, and then he gives them the bread. And David takes the bread and he distributes it to the rest of his men, although it's not lawful to do. Notice that David, in this, he denies the letter of the law regarding the bread of the presence. But he honors his role as king, who is meant to distribute the bread to his people. He honors where he is going and the trajectory that God has him on. This is Jesus' answer to the Pharisees. Hey, do you remember the story of David? Do you remember when he denied this and he fed his own people through this? And Jesus gives his own interpretation of this story, because you'll notice he didn't even mention the Sabbath. Jesus' answer and the story that he tells has nothing to do with the Sabbath or with Sabbath regulations. Instead, it has to do with our relationship to the law and Christ's relationship to the law. So first, here is our relationship to the law. Mark 2:27. He said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Jesus describes there is a sense of priority built into the law. There is a depth of meaning that needs to be understood so that we're able to apply the law in line in our current situations with what the intention of the law is. And so, with the bread of presence, we can see that the bread of presence is meant, the purpose of all of the circumstances around the bread of presence is to demonstrate God's provision. How terrible to take this thing meant to demonstrate God's provision and use it to withhold provision from those in need. David was wise enough to understand that. And the priest that David was working with, they would really partner up after this. The priest that David was working with was wise enough to understand that the purpose of the bread of presence is to demonstrate God's provision. Why would you take this thing intended for your good and then use it to cause harm to those in need? David understood that. Jesus is saying, look at what you're doing with the Sabbath. You're treating it as though man was made for the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was pre-existent and it was for man to come in and actualize, but that's not the case. The Sabbath was made for man. What the Pharisees have done with the Sabbath command is they have taken it and they have turned it into this Procrustean bed. They've taken the Sabbath command, which was made for man. They said, instead, what we'll do is we'll use this thing and we'll contort man so that they fit into it, when they do not realize that it was made for man's flourishing, not the other way around. Sabbath, just as the bread of presence isn't meant to cause starvation, Sabbath is not meant to cause hunger. Sabbath is not meant to discourage the enjoyment of life. In fact, it's precisely the opposite. That's why Sabbath is there. In Deuteronomy 5, when Moses reintroduces the Sabbath in his final sermons before he dies, he reintroduces the Sabbath to his people. And he says, remember, here's what you need to remember in order to be able to live out the Sabbath well. Here's the reason for the Sabbath. You were slaves in Egypt, and God rescued you out of slavery. Therefore, remember the Sabbath day. What is the Sabbath day? It is freedom. No longer are you cursed to work 7 days a week, but now 6 days support 7 days of life. How are humans made? Humans are made so that we work and we rest. What is slavery but having that rest pulled from you? And so the intention of the Sabbath day that God gives to his people after he rescues them out of Egypt is to say, look, I'm restoring your humanity with this day. This is not something that I'm trying to cram your life into, but I am actually using this to bring restoration to the fullness of the humanity that I intended for you to have at the creation. That is the intention of the Sabbath. But the Pharisees, instead, rather than seeing the Sabbath as a glorious gift for the flourishing of man, they view it as a Procrustean bed, which if you will lay down on it, it will only be by contorting the goodness of your humanity to make it fit. They treat it as though man was made for the Sabbath. But the Sabbath was made for man. Now, we tend to demonstrate, in the way that we relate to the law, we often demonstrate a deep concern about living to the left of the law, which means that we'd see, okay, there's the Sabbath day, and we don't do this because we don't take the Sabbath seriously at all. And I don't expect you to, because I'm trying to figure out what I think about the Sabbath. And I'm your pastor, so good luck. But we can imagine with something like the Sabbath, it's like, man, we got to make sure we don't move to the left of the Sabbath. We got to make sure that we uphold it and that we do the Sabbath well. And if we do move to the left of the Sabbath into some like total freedom, abandonment of any sort of constraint. We think, okay, we know we're doing wrong then because we aren't living up to the command of the law. And so we have deep concern about moving to the left of the law, not fulfilling what God has called us to, being disobedient to God's commands. But Jesus demonstrates just as much of a concern about moving to the right of the law, which is to say, we will add to the law to make sure that we fulfill the minimum requirement. In order to make sure we fulfill the minimum, we're going to add all of these other regulations, all of these other ways of understanding what the law is, and we're going to make sure we get those perfectly right. Jesus views both of those things, to the left of the law or to the right of the law, total freedom, total abandonment of the law on the left, total Procrustean bed, I will make the law and the ideal and I will cram my life into it no matter what. Both of those are disobedient to God. Now here's why. It's because they are both representing the same human impulse. To the left of the law, we say God is not good. He has not made the law for our flourishing. He is not calling us to obedience for a goodness that he wants to see fulfilled in us. The law is just to curse us. The law is just for him to punish us. And therefore, the only way to experience the truth of our humanity is to abandon the law and to live in total freedom that we come up with for ourselves. That's a way of saying God is not good, he's not trustworthy, I will be good for myself. Moving to the right of the law is saying God did not make the law for our flourishing, God only made the law to test and to prove us. And so I will make sure that God will be so proved with me, or that I will so prove myself to God, because I will not only fulfill what he has asked, but I will go well beyond it, and I will contort my life into this religious ideal such that God will never be able to question me, and God will always be in my debt, so that I will know that God owes me. On the one side, we ignore God and we call his goodness bad. On the other side, we manipulate God and we call his goodness insufficient. Do you see how both of those are ways of saying, God will not be God of me, God will not be the lawgiver of me, I will be God of me. And I will either manipulate and control him by going to the right of his law, or I will ignore and debase him by going to the left of his law. But certainly, God will not be the one that describes to me what flourishing is. So often we are just concerned with the left, with disobedience. Jesus is equally concerned with the right, with religiosity that seeks to place God in our debt. Now, what is that tendency? Both ways of us placing God in our debt or ignoring him or trying to take the seat of God to define flourishing for ourselves. It's called sin. That's the nature of what sin is. And you give a person the law, and it will expose sin in their hearts. Oftentimes, we miss it with the religious. Because a religious person thinks, you give me the law, finally, I'll just know what to do, and then I'll do it. No, you give a religious person the law, they will go well beyond it and use it to manipulate God, not as a way of enjoying the flourishing God has given them. You give an irreligious person the law, they will rebel against it. And in both ways, the law exposes the depth of the rebellion in our hearts against God, our Creator. In both ways, we say, I'm the one who wants to make myself. I will decide what my flourishing is. And I will either twist you into giving it to me by obeying, or I will ignore you and get it for myself by disobeying. They are the same thing. Sin is exposed in our hearts. But Jesus is able to walk right through the flourishing of the Sabbath. where he goes on a walk with his disciples, and on the Sabbath day, they reach out and they grab a cornstalk, whatever, wheat, whatever, and they have a snack. Because what is the Sabbath like? What is God's law like? When it's understood, when it's given to Jesus, not when it's given to us. What's God's law like? It's like a snack. It's like a day of rest. It's a good thing that was given to us. It's where we find the depth of our flourishing. We realize that all these constraints that it puts on our lives, they're actually where we find the greatest freedom that we could have. Because we're not the type of things that created ourselves. We are created things. We were made with all sorts of boundaries. We're all stuck in time here together, moving forward at a steady pace of 1 minute per minute. Now, one of you, try and move faster. I don't know if I'd be able to tell if any of you are, because I'm only moving at my rate. So maybe we all are, and that's a bigger question. But you understand, we have real constraints. And for God to say, look, these real constraints are given to you from me as a gift for you to find your flourishing. Just like I gave the fish that I made water so that they might find their flourishing, so too for you, I've given you my law. And part of that law is a day of rest. And it's meant to be used for rest. So have a snack. That's what God's law is like. In our sin, we call it bad and to be rebelled against, or we call it insufficient, and we use it to twist and contort and prove ourselves by it. But God gives it to us as a gift to be freely received. But how can people like us, sinners like us, possibly be given the law? We can't be trusted with it. Whenever we're given it, we're just going to use it to prove how wicked we are. So how do we even experience this goodness? I don't know if you've ever tried to Sabbath or if you've ever tried to have a day of rest. I'm a catastrophe at that sort of thing. It took me forever to get ski days right with my wife because I would just be stressing the whole time on the lift about this thing that I need to be doing or this person I should be following up with or what this person's thinking of me, and I would be a catastrophe in those days of rest. You give it to me, I can't even receive a good thing. What has to happen? We have to understand that what's important is not just the way that we relate to the law, which is that it was made for us as a good thing to be received. We have to see how Jesus relates to the law, which is that it belongs to him. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. Mark 2:28. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created on the seventh day when God, after creating the world, steps back and he says, on this day he rests. And that was the creation of the Sabbath day, when God did it. Now, Jesus, who if you were to see him, you'd think there's just another person. He's now standing in front of the Pharisees and saying, I am Lord of the Sabbath. This thing that just God created is mine. I created it. How do I relate to the Sabbath day? As its owner, as the one who made it. Jesus is as clear as ever. He's saying the reason that you don't understand the Sabbath is because you, just like everybody else, is covered in sin. But me, I'm God. And I made this very Sabbath. I know precisely how it's meant to be used. In fact, if you follow me and if you're one of my disciples and you're walking behind me, then you're going to get this incredible experience of exactly what the Sabbath is. You're going to go on a walk on the Sabbath and you're going to say, man, I'm a little hungry. And Jesus is going to turn around and say, grab something to eat. And we'll say, no, look, I know we can't eat on the Sabbath, so thanks for the temptation. He'll say, no, this is mine. This is my day. And I say that if you're hungry on the Sabbath, grab something to eat. Enjoy yourself. I've made a great place for you all. Enjoy it. And so you walk behind and realize, okay, so this is what it's like to walk in the Sabbath, when I'm moving right behind Jesus as he walks through the Sabbath, not to the left of it, ignoring it, not to the right of it, where he's contorting people to try and fit into it, but right in line where he says, I made this for your good. I designed this law for your good. And then he invites them into it so that he might promote their real flourishing in it. To miss the Sabbath is to never rest. It's the slavery that's back in Egypt. We curse against our Creator and we plunge ourselves either to the left of it or to the right of it into this constant restlessness of spirit. And we look and we say, if only I could fulfill this law. When you see the law and the way that we were created to engage with it, where we see, man, our lives would be set free if we could just live in that way. This is a good and glorious thing that was made for us. You see, I just wish I could fulfill that. You can't. But the good news is, Jesus didn't come just so that we could walk behind him and learn how to execute the Sabbath properly. He didn't come just as an example for what it looks like when the Sabbath is appropriately fulfilled. Jesus came so that on behalf of sinners like us, people who, when you give them the law, they call good evil, or they deny the goodness of their Creator. He came so that he would fulfill the law on our behalf. So that when he walks before us in the field, he is not just walking to show us the right way that we should walk, but he's walking towards the cross. He's walking to show, look, when you live in this type of restlessness, it results in death. And so what does Jesus do? He takes on the punishment of the law. So we see Jesus restless before the cross, fulfilling even the punishment of the law on behalf of us sinners, so that we might rest in him. Go to the right of the law. I have no need to prove myself to God. I can see in Jesus that I am fully accepted and atoned for and made perfect in God's presence. I can no longer go to the right of the law in good conscience. Instead, I will only try and receive the law as a good and precious gift from the Lord who freely gives it to me. Go to the left of the law. How could I deny that what God has given me in his constraints is anything but good? Because I've seen that he sent his only son to die for me that I might be brought in. Of course, whatever constraints he has given to me could only be for my flourishing. How else do you explain the depth of love that he's shown towards us in Christ? That is the good news, that Christ has fulfilled the Sabbath for us so that we might receive the Sabbath freely. Jesus has borne the Procrustean bed and was stretched and cut off so that we might simply sleep in it, find rest in it.